Daniel had always believed that life was about doing the best you could with what little you had, and every morning he reminded himself that his little daughter Emily depended on him for everything. He wasn't a man of wealth, nor did he carry a family name that opened doors for him. Instead, he carried his tools, his strength, and his determination. On that particular day, the sun was sharp in the sky when Daniel walked into the sprawling grounds of a billionaire's mansion. The gardens were perfectly trimmed, the marble steps gleamed, and the pool stood like a mirror waiting to be cleaned. He felt small in front of so much grandeur, but he had learned long ago that pride didn't feed a child, hard work did. With sleeves rolled up, Daniel knelt by the poolside, brushing away leaves, scrubbing the walls and making the water glisten under the summer light. Each movement carried a purpose. He never allowed his mind to wander too far because whenever he did, the memory of his late wife would creep in. She had left him far too soon, leaving him to raise Emily alone. It wasn't easy and most days were filled with exhaustion, but every sacrifice was worth it for the smile of his little girl. The pool shimmered as Daniel leaned over it, his reflection showing the lines of responsibility on his face, yet also a quiet strength that kept him moving forward. Unbeknownst to him, someone was watching. Sophia, the daughter of the billionaire who owned the mansion, had been sipping coffee inside the glass-walled lounge. She was used to seeing workers come and go, faceless, nameless, simply part of the routine of maintaining a life of comfort. But Daniel was different. There was something captivating about the way he moved, steady and humble, as though he was doing far more than cleaning a pool. He was carrying an invisible weight that spoke louder than words. Sophia leaned closer to the window, observing him with growing curiosity. She had grown up surrounded by luxury, people who smiled politely but never revealed anything real, and here was a man who seemed unshaken by the environment around him, focused only on the task at hand. Daniel noticed her presence only briefly, a shadow in the reflection of the water, but he quickly looked away, embarrassed to even be caught glancing in her direction. To him she was untouchable, someone who belonged to a world he could never step into. He reminded himself that his duty was to finish the job, collect his pay and leave. That was how he survived, by not letting himself imagine anything beyond his reality. But Sophia, with her inquisitive eyes, was already beginning to feel something unusual. It wasn't the kind of attraction based on appearances alone, though Daniel carried a ruggedness that spoke of quiet masculinity. It was the way his presence radiated a strength she didn't often see in the people around her. As Daniel dipped the net into the pool, fishing out the last of the leaves, he thought about Emily waiting at home. She would probably be playing with the old stuffed bear he had stitched together for her, and he promised himself he would bring her something sweet from the market later. That thought kept him moving, no matter how tired he became. In his world, there was no room for rest, only work and sacrifice. But fate has a way of interrupting even the most disciplined plans, and while Daniel had every intention of leaving quietly after finishing his job, Sophia had already made a decision that would change his day completely. She stood by the doorway now, watching him from a closer distance. The sunlight caught the soft waves of her hair, and her elegance seemed almost unreal compared to the simplicity of the man before her. Yet, instead of looking down at him the way many in her position might, her eyes carried warmth and curiosity. Daniel felt the weight of her gaze but kept his head lowered, focusing on gathering his tools. Inside, he was telling himself to leave quickly before he did something foolish like meeting her eyes and wondering why someone like her was even watching him. But deep down, in that fleeting silence between them, something stirred, a connection that neither of them could fully explain yet. It was the beginning of a story that neither expected, but destiny had already started writing its first line. Daniel tightened the strap of his old leather bag and began to gather his tools, relieved that the job was almost done. The water in the pool sparkled now, reflecting the bright sky above, and he felt the quiet satisfaction of having completed another day's work. It was nothing extraordinary, but for him, every finished task meant money that would go toward Emily's school fees, her meals and her future. He was about to sling the bag over his shoulder when the sound of footsteps reached his ears. He looked up and froze. Sophia was walking toward him, her white summer dress catching the light breeze, her presence both gentle and commanding. For a moment, Daniel felt his throat tighten, unsure if he should stand straighter or simply look away. She smiled politely, the kind of smile that wasn't practiced but natural, and it unsettled him more than if she had ignored him. Daniel quickly wiped his hands on his work shirt, trying to appear professional. In his mind, she was someone far removed from his world, a daughter of immense privilege, someone whose footsteps had only ever touched polished marble floors. He expected her to simply nod, perhaps thank him out of courtesy, and walk away. Instead, she stopped in front of him, her eyes meeting his with a calmness that made his heart stumble. "You've been working hard," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of genuine appreciation. Daniel nodded, awkwardly, unsure how to respond without sounding out of place. He muttered something about just doing his job. his eyes flickering back to the pool as though the glistening water could save him from the sudden discomfort of her attention. But Sophia didn't leave. After a pause, she tilted her head slightly and asked almost hesitantly, "Would you stay for a little while? Maybe join me for a drink?" The words hit Daniel like a wave, unexpected and disorienting. He blinked, convinced he had misheard her. Stay? For a drink? He was a worker, covered in the day's sweat and dust, his hands rough from years of labor. She was a woman whose every detail spoke of refinement and privilege. Surely she couldn't be serious. He opened his mouth to politely decline, already rehearsing the excuses in his mind. He had more jobs to get to, his daughter was waiting. He wasn't dressed for something like that. But then he saw the look in her eyes. It wasn't pity, nor was it the condescending curiosity of someone amused by a stranger from a different world. It was a look of sincerity, as though she truly wanted his company. Daniel hesitated, his hand still gripping the strap of his bag. Inside, a storm of conflicting thoughts raged. Accepting her invitation could mean crossing a line he had no business stepping over. He feared the judgment that might come if anyone in her family saw them, or worse, if he allowed himself to feel something he couldn't afford. Yet there was a gentleness in her request that pulled at him. He had spent years building walls around his life, protecting himself from disappointment. But in that moment, those walls began to tremble. Sophia waited patiently, as though understanding his struggle. She wasn't used to men refusing her company. Most tried too hard, eager to impress. But Daniel's hesitation only deepened her intrigue. She wanted to know more about the man who worked with such quiet dignity, the man who seemed to carry an entire world on his shoulders without complaint. Finally, Daniel let out a small breath, lowering his eyes before meeting hers again. "I shouldn't take much of your time," he said carefully, his voice betraying the battle inside him. Her lips curved into a smile, one that carried both relief and delight. "Then it's settled," she said warmly. "Just a drink." With those words, Daniel's world shifted. He followed her toward the patio, his steps uncertain, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and curiosity. For years his routine had been predictable: work, home, care for Emily and sleep. But today, something different had entered his life. Something unpredictable, something dangerous yet strangely inviting. The invitation wasn't just about a drink. It was the opening of a door he never thought he'd be asked to walk through. Daniel sat down carefully on the edge of the patio chair, his hands resting stiffly on his knees as though afraid of leaving marks on the polished wood. The view from where he sat was breathtaking. The pool he had just cleaned shimmered under the fading afternoon sun, the garden around it alive with color. But Daniel hardly noticed any of it. His attention was divided between the glass of juice placed in front of him and the presence of Sophia across the small table. He felt out of place, as if at any moment someone would come and remind him that he didn't belong here. Still, Sophia's calm expression and the gentle way she poured the drink eased him, if only a little. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Tell me about yourself," she said, her tone more inviting than demanding. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Most people in her world didn't care to ask about men like him. They saw workers as shadows, important enough to complete tasks but invisible beyond that. He wasn't used to sharing pieces of his life, especially with someone who looked like she belonged in a life he could never touch. But something about her gaze was different. She wasn't asking out of politeness, she truly wanted to know. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice a little rough at first. He spoke simply, telling her that he was a single father raising his daughter, Emily, on his own. He told her about his daily work, how he took whatever jobs he could find: pool cleaning, small repairs, odd shifts at construction sites. His words carried no pride and no shame, only honesty. Sophia listened intently, her chin resting lightly on her hand, her eyes never drifting away from his face. The mention of Emily brought a subtle light into Daniel's tone, softening the weight of his voice. He described how Emily loved to draw, how she would wait by the window every evening for him to come home, and how her laughter was what kept him going even when his body ached with exhaustion. As he spoke, Sophia felt a warmth in her chest that she couldn't quite explain. She was used to conversations about business deals, social events, and shallow chatter that barely scratched the surface of life. But Daniel's words painted a vivid picture of sacrifice, devotion, and resilience. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't hiding behind a mask. Every sentence revealed the kind of man he was: steady, dependable, and deeply human. For a moment she envied Emily, not for the wealth or luxury, but for having a father who loved her so purely. Daniel, however, couldn't stop the occasional wave of discomfort that rose within him. He kept thinking about how absurd this moment was. Him sitting across from a billionaire's daughter, sipping juice on a patio where expensive chandeliers hung above and manicured gardens stretched as far as the eye could see. He tried to steady himself, reminding his heart that this was temporary, that soon he would leave and return to the life he knew. Yet every time he looked up and found Sophia's eyes waiting for his, He felt something break inside the walls he had built around himself. Sophia asked him questions about Emily, about what she wanted to become, about the small joys that lit up their lives. Daniel answered shyly, but as the minutes turned into an hour, he found himself speaking more freely. It was strange, how easily words came when someone was truly listening. For so long he had carried his stories silently, with no one to share it with. Now here was this woman from an entirely different world, sitting across from him, leaning into his every word as though it mattered. And in truth it mattered to her more than she could admit. For the first time in years, Sophia felt a conversation reach into her heart rather than skim across the surface. She realized that beneath all the wealth, the luxury and the walls of her father's empire, she had been missing something real. Daniel's honesty, his struggles and above all his love for his daughter, stirred something within her that she couldn't quite name. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden hues across the patio, the silence between them grew heavier but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, that carried an unspoken understanding. Sophia smiled softly, her eyes lingering on him. Daniel looked away, his chest tightening with the dangerous thought that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a simple drink anymore. It was something else. Something he wasn't sure he was ready to face, but something that was already pulling him closer. The sky was beginning to change colors, painting soft streaks of gold and crimson over the horizon. When Daniel finally set his glass down, he realized he had been sitting there far longer than he intended. What was supposed to be a brief pause after work had turned into hours of conversation, laughter, and shared silences that spoke louder than words. For the first time in a very long time, Daniel felt something loosen inside his chest. The constant heaviness he carried, the pressure of bills, the ache of exhaustion, the loneliness that crept in after Emily fell asleep seemed lighter, if only for this moment. He looked across the table at Sophia, and for a fleeting second he allowed himself to simply see her, not as a billionaire's daughter but as a woman who had listened to him without judgment. Sophia felt it too. She had lost track of time, lost in the way his stories carried weight, in the way his rough hands gestured carefully when he spoke of Emily, and in the honesty that lingered in every word. It was rare for her to feel at ease with someone. In her world, people often wore masks, speaking only what was convenient or expected, but Daniel was different. He didn't even try to impress her, and that was what made him unforgettable. She found herself wondering about Emily, about the life Daniel led, and about why she suddenly cared so deeply about a man she had only met that afternoon. Yet with every passing minute, Daniel felt the pull of reality return. He thought about Emily waiting at home, about dinner that needed to be cooked, about the world that reminded him constantly of his place. The laughter between them was genuine, but it couldn't erase the distance between their lives. He knew this wasn't his world. The mansion, the luxury, the woman in front of him, it all belonged to a place he had no claim to. Rising slowly, he cleared his throat, breaking the spell that had wrapped around them. "I should go," he said quietly, his voice carrying both gratitude and restraint. Sophia's smile faltered, her eyes searching his face as though she wanted to stop him. She didn't want the moment to end. Something about the way he carried himself, with humility and strength, had touched her in ways she couldn't explain. But she also knew that pushing him would only make him retreat further. So instead of insisting, she simply nodded, though her heart was not ready to let him go. As he picked up his worn bag, their eyes met one last time, and in that gaze lingered a silent promise, something unspoken yet undeniably present. Daniel walked through the garden toward the gate, each step heavier than the tools he carried. He told himself it was just a drink, just a conversation, nothing more. But deep inside he knew that something had shifted. Life had a way of surprising people in the most ordinary of moments, and today, while cleaning a pool, he had stumbled into something extraordinary. He tried to convince himself it meant nothing, but his heart knew better. Sophia's eyes, her smile, the way she listened, it all lingered like a soft echo that refused to fade. Sophia remained seated, watching him leave, her heart caught in a storm of emotions. She had spent years surrounded by people who offered her everything but sincerity, and now, a single father with calloused hands and tired eyes had given her something she didn't even know she was missing. She pressed her lips together, realizing that this was not the end, but the beginning of a story neither of them had expected. It wasn't love yet, not fully. It was too soon for that. But it was a spark, small, fragile and dangerous, that could grow into something neither of them had imagined. And as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, both Daniel and Sophia carried with them the weight of that spark, knowing it would return to them in thoughts, in dreams, and perhaps in the paths destiny would carve for them.